Welcome back to Pokemon episode summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 347, a 6-pack attack. The episode begins with Ash and the gang having left Petalburg City after Ash had won his 5th gym badge, and they were now on the way to the next gym, with Ash admiring all his badges in his badge case, including his newest badge, the Balance Badge from Norman. And he happily declared that he only needed 3 more badges to enter the Hoenn League. He then asks Brock where they were heading next, specifically asking where the next gym was located, leading Brock to remind Ash of what he had said before they began their trek back to Petalburg, which was that the next gym was in Fortree City. Ash gets extremely excited about this and proudly declares that their next stop would be Fortree City, although May retorted that even if Fortree City did end up being their next destination, they would arrive at other places first, as they always did, because they never seemed to just arrive at their destination immediately. And Max stated that he was kind of bored with gym battles, especially after Norman's gym battle, because he thought that nothing could really top that one now, after being convinced by Norman last episode that the gym battle was awesome. Ash didn't care what May and Max said, although May reminded Ash that he should really care about what she said, at least, because they were going to arrive somewhere else first, being Little Root Town, reminding Ash that they had decided that they were going to go back to Professor Birch's lab in Little Root Town before continuing on their journey. And Ash remembered this, admitting that he did promise that Little Root would actually be their next destination, with Ash excited to see Birch's expression when he sees how much they've grown, and May excited to show Professor Birch all the Pokemon she had captured on her journey. Just then, we see that Ash and the gang had arrived in Little Root Town, and Ash was the first one to spot Professor Birch's lab in the distance, atop a cliff, and they were about to head over to it, when suddenly, Professor Birch drives his SUV over a nearby cliff. Yeah, that's right, he rode down a cliff, it was impressive, and then he skidded to a stop right next to Ash and the gang, stopping himself before he ran them over. Relieving Ash and the gang, as they were very fucking scared that they were going to get run over, and they were scared that Professor Birch was about to run into the side of the cliff that he just came down, but thankfully he didn't. Ash and the gang did complain a little bit, though, as thanks to Professor Birch's skidding, they had been covered from some sand and dirt on the road, although Professor Birch came out of his SUV and apologized to them, greeting them as well. Ash and the gang reintroduced themselves, although Professor Birch clarified that he definitely knew who they were, and with that, they were reacquainted. Professor Birch then begins to go on and on about all the field work he'd been doing, when he realized that he'd actually been so focused on all of his field work that he forgot that he had to meet up with Professor Oak at the Little Root Town Harbor, so that they could actually meet in person for the first time. Ash was shocked that Oak was coming to Little Root, and questioned why Oak had decided to do so, now of all times, leading Birch to reveal that he and Oak were having a little bit of a disagreement, so he invited Oak over so that they could settle the disagreement in person, leading Ash and the gang to get a little embarrassed, knowing that Oak would likely win the argument, because Oak was far more renowned. Ash then declared that he'd like to see how Oak was doing as well, as it'd been a long time since they met up in person, so Birch allows Ash to accompany him, and Brock decides to come along as well, as Ash and Brock jump into Birch's SUV with him, while May and Max decide to stay at the lab and wait for them to return with Oak, as they wave goodbye and the SUV speeds off down a mountain trail. Max began to go insane with excitement, knowing that soon Oak would come to the lab and he would finally be able to meet his idol in person. Meanwhile, as the SUV speeds on the mountain trail, Birch became distracted as he pointed out a skarmory perched on a rock that was very pointy, and he proceeded to greet it while driving by, while Ash and Brock admired it. Since Professor Birch was super distracted, though, he wasn't paying attention to where he was driving, and he suddenly looked out the front window to see an old man in a wagon being pulled by a camera straight in front of him, and he was about to run it over, and the wagon was even heading for him. Birch freaked out and quickly swerved the SUV, just missing the old man and the camera, who were entirely oblivious to the situation, likely because the old man was probably fucking senile or some shit. Although Ash and Brock were fucking traumatized from almost dying and crashing, and Ash and Brock were able to recover when Birch embarrassingly assured them that everything was fine, despite him almost getting them all killed. And they soon drive away past the old man in his wagon towards the docks. Unbeknownst to Birch, Brock, and Ash, though, there was actually a passenger in the back of the wagon driven by the old man, who was taking a break, resting against the hay with a cowboy hat on, sleeping. And this old man was none other than Professor Oak, who decided to hitch a ride on the wagon, since he had already arrived at the port, and since Birch wasn't there, he decided to just head to Birch's lab on his own. So now, Ash, Brock, and Birch were going to the docks to get Oak, when in reality there was no reason to. Meanwhile, as for May and Max, they had went up to Birch's lab and were instantly greeted by his assistant, Joshua. Remember him? Well, the reason why Max and May instantly met up with Joshua was because he was currently outside taking care of the 3 newest starter Pokemon that Birch had been delivered. Obviously still a Trico, Mudkip, and Torchic, but just different ones from the first time that, May got her starter and all that. And May and Max admired them, although since Joshua was holding the Mudkip, they only looked at the Mudkip and they pet Trico and Torchic. Joshua then comments on how it had sure been a while since May started her journey and got her first starter Pokemon, pointing to the Torchic, and this leads May to happily remember all the incidents that happened on the day she got Torchic and the day she started her journey. Even all the bad stuff, because really most of the entire first couple days were pretty shit, and we then see flashbacks of all this. Such as when she got startled by a Duskull, not liking Pokemon, when she first left to go get her starter, and she also remembered being attacked by Professor Birch's Mudkip by accident. May then commented on her growth since her first day, stating that while that first day was exciting, she had come a long way since then, although Max butted in, stating that she hadn't really changed that much since her first day, since she still wasn't very good with Pokemon, and starts to point out all her failures with them, which annoys May as she begins to chase him in circles around the outside of the lab. But while Max was trying to get away from May and tried to convince her to stop chasing him, saying he was just joking around, he ends up bumping into a man. and falls down because of this. This man was actually the same man that was the passenger in the wagon. So, this guy was Professor Oak, and he told Max to be more careful, lifting his cowboy hat that was tilted down to reveal himself as Professor Oak, leaving Max in total shock as Professor Oak greets him and May, as well as Joshua. Max was in such shock that he decided that he had to do a physical examination of Professor Oak to make sure he was actually real. This left Max absolutely amazed, as upon completing his inspection from all sides, Max was able to determine that Professor Oak really was real. And upon officially declaring this, Max then shows Professor Oak photos of him from Pokémon magazine he got, and stated that he really wanted Oak to autograph them, waiting for a long time. Before Oak could even agree, Max quickly handed Oak all of the photos, and luckily for him, Professor Oak happily signed them with a pen, and then gives back the photos, leaving Max amazed at Oak's beautiful signature. Just then, Oak took notice of the fact that Ash, Brock, and Birch were all not there, and asked Max, May, and Joshua where they were, leading Joshua to explain that Ash and Brock accompanied Birch to pick up Oak from the docks in Birch's Jeep. Oak laughs upon hearing this, stating that he thought Professor Birch had forgot about him, so that's why he decided to go to the lab by himself, and didn't think that Birch would even bother coming for him at this point. Oak then turns his attention to Max, asking how he liked the signed photos, with Max jumping in happiness in response. Max then changed the subject, revealing that he was curious as to if the Kanto starter Pokemon were still the same as he had heard, and wondered if Oak had brought any of these starter Pokemon with him, or just any Pokemon at all. He just wanted to play with some. Oak was kind of freaked out by Max's immense enthusiasm and told him to calm down, but nonetheless, he reached into his bag that was over his shoulder and pulled out 3 Pokeballs, which had the 3 Kanto starters, Charmander, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle in them, and he called them out. Max was very happy to see these Kanto starters, as he inspected them thoroughly, wanting to learn everything he could about them. Meanwhile, as for Team Rocket, they were currently in the bushes and spying on Max, May, Joshua, and Oak, as well as the currently 6 starter Pokemon that were outside, the 3 Kanto starters and the 3 Hoenn starters. James and Jesse then expressed their wishes to get the 6 starter Pokemon for themselves so that they could become extra powerful, although Meowth shut down this idea, suggesting that they give the 6 starter Pokemon to Giovanni instead, assuring Jesse and James that he would love them as a gift. Jesse and James questioned why Giovanni would especially like them, leading Meowth to have a boss fantasy and explain it, detailing that it involved Giovanni sitting on a tree, watching over a beautiful sunset as a whole bunch of Wingull flew in the sun, and Giovanni would then turn around and see the 6 starter Pokemon standing behind him, supporting him. And then after this, Meowth envisioned Giovanni going to his backyard and playing with all 6 of the starter mons, and also training them to become good Team Rocket members, which would in turn give him more confidence in his team, since he would have personally appointed the Pokemon as members. Jesse and James liked this, and they proceeded to cheer for the plan, as Meowth joined in on the cheer as well. They were officially going to try and steal all 6 starter Pokemon. Meanwhile, back outside the lab of Birches, Max was still inspecting all the starters, especially thrilled to have the opportunity to examine Bulbasaur and see him up close, admitting that he learned a lot about Bulbasaur from Professor Oak's lectures that made him want to see it in person. But now that he had seen it in person, he realized that he could learn a whole lot more, as he began to touch Bulbasaur's ball to feel its texture. As he examined the ball and touched it once, he told Oak that Bulbasaur appeared to have a very healthy look to it, and Oak commented that he tried his best to keep the starter Pokemon well raised. Just then though, Max starts to really go in on Bulbasaur's ball, prodding it all over with his finger, not just one touch. So Oak warns Max to stop, stating that Bulbasaur didn't really like that, although Max didn't stop by the time Bulbasaur in fact revealed this to Max by turning around and using Tackle on Max to knock him down. May then rushes over to Max and the Bulbasaur and asks if Max was alright, and Max simply shrugged off his minor injury, being too distracted and impressed with the strength of Bulbasaur's tackle. Having examined Bulbasaur enough, Max turns his attention to the other 2 Kanto starters, Charmander and Squirtle, and begins poking and prodding at them, right on their faces, which pisses them off, as Charmander uses Ember and Squirtle uses Water Gun on Max. So, Max gets burned by Charmander, and then ironically the fire gets extinguished by Water Gun, although these were both technically annoying attacks. Although Max wasn't annoyed at all, he was excited to even be acknowledged by the Pokemon in any way, shape, or form. Oak laughs, amused at Max's positive attitude, even while being attacked, admitting that back when he was a kid, he learned that the Kanto starters attacked like that when he poked and prodded at them in a similar way, even though he didn't condone it now. He had to admit that every kid was curious, stating that if Max liked the Pokemon so much, then he could have the responsibility of looking after them today, since Professor Birch was gone, and he wanted a break. Max didn't even believe what Oak said, but Oak assured Max that he was telling the truth, saying that if Max was up for it, then Oak would have no problem letting him look after the Pokemon. Max saluted and said that he would do his best, with May adding that she would try her best to help as well. May then became weirded out just then, as Bulbasaur came up to her and held its vine up to her, and she didn't understand what Bulbasaur wanted, but she soon realized that this was Bulbasaur's way of being friendly, and Bulbasaur wanted her to shake its vine, like how humans shook hands, so she shook its vine, greeting it. Seeing Bulbasaur happy from this makes her happy, and she starts to really like Bulbasaur as a Pokemon. Maybe she'll catch one of her own one day? Anyways. This moment was interrupted as a large Skiploom mech rised above the nearby trees, coming out of the forest, and approached them. Of course, Team Rocket immediately come out of the mech, and Meowth presses a button to launch a huge net to capture all 6 of the starter Pokemon, and then bring them back to the Skiploom mech, not even bothering with doing their motto yet. Everyone yells for Team Rocket to come back and give the starters back, but Team Rocket obviously refused and begin to fly away in their mech. So, Oak instructs Joshua to wait at the laboratory for Ash and Brock and guard the place in case Team Rocket ended up coming back to steal some equipment or some shit, while he, May, and Max would chase after the Skiploom mech and try and retrieve the 6 starters. So Joshua agreed and stayed at the lab, while Oak, Max, and May rushed off. Meanwhile, back with Ash, Brock, and Birch, they had all arrived at the docks to get Oak, but they were very surprised at why Oak seemingly hadn't shown up at the docks yet, thinking that his ship must not have arrived yet, since he wasn't there. So Birch decided to call Joshua using the dock's phone to see if he knew anything, and sure enough, Joshua answered while at the lab and informed Birch that Oak had already arrived. But now wasn't at the lab currently because he had left since Team Rocket had stolen the starter Pokemon, so he had went to chase after them to find them. Hearing this, Birch promised to get back as soon as possible, declaring that once they got back, they would go after Team Rocket as well. But in the meantime, Birch asked Joshua to do something, which was to find something that belonged to Oak, as well as May or Max, knowing that May and Max had went with Oak as well, according to Joshua. Meanwhile, Oak, May, and Max had ended up chasing the mech, but had lost it by the time they ended up arriving in a river with a waterfall. Oak tried to think of where Team Rocket could have disappeared to, knowing that it would be pretty difficult to just wander off so easily in a giant Skiploom mech. They had to have left tracks or a path somehow. And it was then, after a few minutes of examining the area, that Oak notices a cave behind a nearby waterfall, which was lit by electric lights. Seeing these lights, they decided to go inside the cave, knowing that something had to be up because someone had to have placed those lights there. They couldn't have just appeared naturally. Meanwhile, Birch, Ash, and Brock had arrived back at Birch's lab, where Joshua was waiting, having done as he was told, and got an item from either May, Max, or Oak, which happened to be Max's backpack. So Joshua quickly gave it to Birch while he was still in the SUV, and the three of them drove off in the SUV to find Oak, May, and Max, leaving Joshua behind. While Birch, Brock, and Ash were speeding extremely fast in the SUV, Oak, Max, and May, on the other hand, were walking extremely slow, investigating the cave, having gone in through a waterfall. But unbeknownst to Oak, May, and Max, Oak had actually triggered a motion sensor, since Oak was the first one to walk past it, and May and Max activated it shortly after. And, of course, this motion tracker was set up by Team Rocket, and it quickly closed the main entrance of the cave completely shut, and activated a camera, turning it on, that watched over Oak, May, and Max. That was also designed by Team Rocket. Of course, this camera alerted Team Rocket since the video feed was sent to them. Soon enough, Oak, May, and Max come across the 6 starter Pokemon trapped in a cage, and they rush to them, but, of course, there was a trap set up, a classic pitfall trap, so when Oak, May, and Max run to save the Pokemon, they fall into the hole, causing a lot of dust to be kicked up. May was obviously annoyed by this, and she went to go send out her Pokemon, so that they could potentially help them climb up or some shit. Primarily Beautyfly, but she was going to send them all out. But before May could do this, a large vacuum suddenly sucked the Pokeballs up, and May, Max, and Oak quickly saw that James was wearing the vacuum, and it was Team Rocket that now had possession of May's Pokemon, and they laughed at Oak, May, and Max for this, and then ran off, taking May's Pokemon with them, and closing a gigantic iron bar over the hole so that Max, May, and Oak couldn't get out unless they had help. Meanwhile, back outside the cave, Birch, Ash, and Brock were now in the SUV again, with Birch driving through a huge, rocky path instead of an actual road, which made Ash and Brock terrified. But Birch assured them that they were perfectly safe, since Birch's friend actually lived around the area, so he knew this road quite well, and he would try his best not to get them murdered on it, claiming that going this way would hopefully help them find Oak, Max, and May. Birch tried to assure Brock and Ash that they were completely safe, but Brock and Ash only doubted this even more when Birch drive the SUV off of a ledge, and they somehow didn't die. Meanwhile, back in the hole, May, Max, and Oak were awaiting anyone to come and rescue them, hoping that Brock, Birch, and Ash would eventually come to their aid. They eventually get tired of waiting though, and Oak gets an idea after Max suggests that he might be small enough to squeeze through the iron bars, stating that he had a better idea, asking if he could borrow the photos that he signed for Max. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was celebrating their victory, and now having their first base, because that's what this cave was. They had actually constructed it, and made their own base finally. And they were celebrating with a toast of what actually seemed to be champagne. Damn, Pokemon, because Team Rocket was acting drunk as fuck. Anyways, while they drank, they watched as a waterfall shot up water behind them, and they mentioned how they actually spent all of their money to build the base, but due to how drunk they were too lightheaded to even fully process this. Hey, they were so drunk that they didn't even realize they were drinking alcohol. They thought they were drinking cave water from the waterfall. Well, apparently, though, they weren't that drunk, because James suggested that they should probably look at the surveillance camera to see how May, Max, and Oak were doing, to see if they escaped. So Meowth pulled up the camera and assured Jesse and James that there was nothing to worry about, thinking that seeing Oak in the hole was enough evidence to assume that they were all trapped. And he was too drunk to realize that it was only Oak on the camera, and Oak appeared to be very stiff and in a weird pose, not moving whatsoever. But, yeah, Team Rocket being drunk, when Jesse and James did notice this, they assumed that he was just sitting there, frozen with fear. But we then see what was actually going on, after we see Team Rocket cheer foolishly, which was that, back in the hole, Oak, May, and Max were actually working on their escape, with Oak having placed one of Max's pictures of him in front of the camera to make it look like Oak was there, and that explained why he was so still, because it was only a photo. So with Team Rocket Fool, Max got on top of Oak and May, and with the added height, he was able to squeeze through the iron bars because he was so small, so he was free. And now, Oak instructed Max to release the Pokemon from their cage so that the Pokemon could help get May and Oak out, since they couldn't fit through the iron bars. First, Max asked Oak how he was supposed to even get the starter Pokemon free, leading Oak to reveal that he had to have one of the Pokemon use a fire attack, then one of the Pokemon use a water attack, and then one of the Pokemon use a tackle, because all that combined should destroy the cage. So Max ran up to the starters in the cage, and Max had both Torchic and Charmander for double firepower, heat up the bars of the cage, and then Max had both Mudkip and Squirtle for double water power, wet the heated bars with Water Gun, and this weakened them, so Bulbasaur and Trico could use Tackle and Pound, respectively, on the bars to set all the Pokemon free. All the starter Pokemon were very grateful to Max for helping them get out of the cage, so they all jumped on him and started hugging and tickling him out of gratitude. Meanwhile, outside the cave, Ash and Brock wondered how they were ever going to find May, Max, and Oak, since they didn't even know where they went, and they were hoping that somehow May, Max, and Brock would just end up coming to them. But they didn't, obviously, but thankfully Birch had an idea, as he whistled loudly in the form of a tune, which made a Poochyena appear and come down from the cliff. And once it did, Birch had it smell Max's backpack to pick up Max's scent, and the Poochyena quickly took off after picking up the scent. Basically, that was Birch's plan, and why he had asked for an item belonging to May, Max, or Oak, since he could use their scent to find them. So, knowing that Poochyena was making its way to Max, and presumably May and Oak as well, Birch, Brock, and Ash gave chase down the canyon. Meanwhile, back inside the cave, Max used the starter Pokemon to get May and Oak free, doing the same thing that got the starters free in the first place, telling Torchic and Charmander to heat up the iron bars, Squirtle and Mudkip to cool off the heated bars, and then Trico and Bulbasaur to break them with Pound and Tackle, and with that, May and Oak were free. Oak thanks Max for all of his help getting them out, while May primarily focuses on thanking Bulbasaur, still very fond of it. Seeing May interact with the Pokemon reminds Oak that they still had to retrieve May's Pokemon from Team Rocket, so they set off to do that, with May revealing that that's been on her mind the entire time already. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was still celebrating their capture of the starter Pokemon, not knowing they were free, celebrating the fact that Oak, Max, and May were believed to still be captured as well, as they stuffed their faces with a whole bunch of food they'd somehow collected, and continued to get more and more drunk, drinking more and more alcohol. But unbeknownst to them, May, Oak, and Max had managed to find the main area of Team Rocket's base where they were, and hid behind a rock in the cave, spying on them, much like how Team Rocket usually spied on them. As May, Max, and Oak watched, they saw Team Rocket then transition to dancing after they ate, and they knew that Team Rocket were now distracted, as they continued to dance and talked drunkenly about how good the ramen they just ate was. May also took notice of her 3 Pokeballs containing Torchic, Skitty, and Beautyfly just off to the side on the table, and she wondered how they could get past Team Rocket to retrieve them, when suddenly Oak noticed a Zubat sleeping on the cave ceiling and got an idea involving Zubat and Bulbasaur. So Oak put his plan into effect, and it affected the dancing drunk Team Rocket, as Oak had the Zubat use Supersonic, managing to instruct it solely because Oak was such a good professor, and this Supersonic immensely hurt Team Rocket's ears, distracting them even more, so Bulbasaur could sneak up and use his Vine Whip to grab May's Pokeballs from afar and return them to her. May thanked Bulbasaur for this, and now that they were free, they had no reason to stay in this cave, so they ran back to the entrance that they came through, only to find it, of course, sealed shut by a door, because if you remember, when Oak triggered the motion sensor, it caused the door to lock them all in. It turns out that once the camera had been activated, it in turn set up another motion sensor by the entrance. So even though the motion sensor wasn't there when Max, May, and Oak first walked in, now it was there. So this one actually caused an alarm to go off, therefore alerting Team Rocket that there were people at the entrance. Since the camera was also activated by the entrance, Jessie checks this one, and in fact sees Oak, May, and Max at the entrance, but she was confused, thinking that they should have been in the hole still. So Jessie checks back on that camera, and Jessie noticed the photo of Professor Oak that had been placed there, and although she still didn't recognize that it was a photo at first, and wondered how Oak could possibly be in 2 places at once, it soon fell down off the camera lens, so it was obvious that it was a photo now. Jessie was already angry, realizing that she'd been fooled, but she got even angrier when James panicked, pointing out that May's Pokeballs were gone, so May, Max, and Oak must have retrieved them. Team Rocket were so mad that Meowth pressed a switch in their base's control room, which causes a wall of iron bars to drop down, blocking the way that Oak, May, and Max had just came. So now the bars were blocking them on one side, and the door was blocking them on the other side. So basically, they were trapped in one little spot between the door and the bars. Luckily for Oak, May, and Max, though, along with the starter Pokemon, a Dugtrio suddenly burrowed from underground, and now that it was inside the little trap area with Oak, May, and Max, Oak suggested that everyone use the hole that Dugtrio had just dug to come up to the surface to escape. So everyone goes through this hole. Oak initially had trouble fitting through the hole as he was too big, though thankfully some more Dugtrio then dug up, and it made the hole even bigger when they came to the surface, so Oak was able to get through, and as soon as he came down, he realized that they were all now in an underground spring, and Max was the first one to point out a Gyarados sleeping in the middle of the spring with its head resting on a rock. Oak warns that Gyarados are known for being extremely aggressive, and therefore advises that they better be extremely quiet so as to not wake it. So they continue through the spring, tiptoeing to not wake it up. Meanwhile, as for Team Rocket, they had decided to go to the entrance where they believed that Max, May, and Oak were still trapped so that they could taunt them and scold them for trying to escape, but Team Rocket just ended up getting extremely angry when they noticed that Oak, Max, and May had escaped through a dug hole. And the dug trio were gone, so they presumably had went down the hole to go somewhere else as well. But anyways, Team Rocket got the idea to follow down the hole to try and recapture May, Max, and Oak, with Meowth leading the way. After James had pressed a remote control that caused the iron bars to lift up so that they could even get to the hole in the first place, and Meowth was startled when he saw the same sleeping Gyarados that Oak, May, and Max had saw, not knowing that they had already walked past it. And he, much like Oak, knew of Gyarados' temper and decided to be quiet as he walked past it, looking for May, Max, and Oak. Even though he was extremely quiet, Jesse and James then came down the hole right at that time and were arguing about who should have gone first, because they were both finding it very annoying to fit through the hole, and they wanted one of them to go down first to endure the pain first. Jesse and James' loud yelling happens to wake up the sleeping Gyarados, and Team Rocket panics as Gyarados then sends Team Rocket blasting off with a Hydro Pump. Meanwhile, Birch, Brock, and Ash were now running along the river, following Poochyena, when Birch noticed a sad Poliwrath in the river, and then a group of Zubat sleeping on a nearby tree. Birch then notices the waterfall up ahead, and remarks that something really strange was going on, because Poliwrath was in the river, but it should have been closer to the waterfall, as he knew that Poliwrath usually lived near the waterfall, and he also found it weird that the Zubat were sleeping in trees, as the Zubat usually lived exclusively in caves. So, knowing that there should have technically been both a waterfall and a cave nearby, if this were the case, Birch began to suspect that there was a cave behind the waterfall. So, he, Ash, and Brock went to go inspect the waterfall, and they found out that yes, there was a cave behind the waterfall. The same cave that Team Rocket, May, Max, and Oak were in. Speaking of May, Max, and Oak, they had now made it out of the underground spring, and were extremely close to the other way to get out of the cave, the exit. But they found that the exit had been blocked off as well, when the motion tracker was triggered by another steel door blocking the way. Max then notices that through the side of the cave was a small hole, and even though they unfortunately found that it was too small for any of them to fit through, even Max thought that he could at least crawl through the hole to see if anyone could hear him on the other side. Fortunately, Max's hopes that someone would hear came true, because while Birch, Ash, and Brock had made it to the entrance of the cave and saw it blocked off by the first steel door, Poochyena then heard Max's calling and rushed off to where the calling was coming from, leading Ash, Brock, and Birch to follow, and they eventually arrived where the calling was coming from, being the second door on the outside of it. Since Ash, Birch, and Brock were so close to the source of the sound, even they were able to hear it, and Ash was the first one to identify the calling as coming from Max's voice, so Ash responded, asking Max what happened, leading Max, Oak, and May to explain, relieving Ash that Oak, May, and Max had all been found, although Max explains that he, Oak, and May were trapped and they needed to get out, so Oak tried to find a way to get them out by inspecting the sealed door. Upon completing inspection, Oak came to the conclusion that the best way to get the door open would be to use a combination of attacks, specifically a water attack to dampen the door, and then a thunderbolt, which should destroy it. So, Brock sent out his Mudkip and Lombre and had them use a water gun to douse the door with water, and then Pikachu used Thunderbolt to electrocute it, and although it severely damaged the door wasn't completely destroyed. So, Oak then suggested to Max that Max deal the final blow, knowing that some tackles would be enough to fully knock the door down. Max questioned how Oak wanted him to do this, leading Oak to order Max to pick some Pokemon out of the starters that knew tackle. Max obliged, knowing that out of the Pokemon there, Bulbasaur, Mudkip, and Squirtle knew tackle, so he picked them, and Oak picked Trico so that he could have Trico use Pound as well. And then May decided to send out her Skitty to assist with its own tackle attack. And with the power of Oak using Trico, May using Skitty, and Max using Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Mudkip, the door was finally smashed down permanently, freeing all the starter Pokemon and all of May's Pokemon, and May, Oak, and Max. Everyone cheers and happily reunites, with Ash and Brock surprised to see all the starter Pokemon, but this happy reunion was cut short when, just as the two groups were now standing by each other, Team Rocket used a loudspeaker that was in their Skiploom mech that they had went back into after they had blasted off, and after they said their motto, the Skiploom mech bursted out from the roof of the base, because although Team Rocket had been blasted off, they'd only been blasted off further down into the cave, and they were able to locate their Skiploom mech, and now they were in it. Team Rocket then declared their plan to capture not just the 6 starters this time, but also Ash's Pikachu, May's Skitty, Brock's Lombre and Mudkip, and the Poochyena, and they extended a whole bunch of mechanical arms from the Skiploom mech to do so. James continued to release more and more mechanical hands as Team Rocket laughed at this, but they shouldn't have laughed, as all the Pokemon were simply just able to dodge the mechanical hands, including Pikachu, who tried to destroy the Skiploom mech with a Thunderbolt, but Team Rocket just laughed, claiming that the mech was electric-proof. So, Brock had his Lombre and Mudkip try water guns instead, but they did nothing either, as Team Rocket just laughed, claiming their mech was waterproof as well. Ash and the gang began to panic, not knowing how to destroy the mech, but then Birch got an idea, as he suggested that in order to destroy the mech, they simply just work together and use multiple attacks at the same time, with Oak agreeing. So, that's exactly what everyone did. Max has Charmander and Torchic use Ember because he wanted to help out, and Brock has his Mudkip and Lombre use Water Gun, May has her Skitty use Blizzard, and all of these attacks combined cause the Skiploom mech to crack, allowing Pikachu to blow up the mech with a Thunderbolt, sending Team Rocket blasting off. Oak was very proud of everyone for managing to blast off Team Rocket, and as a reward, he unveils a new haiku of his for the first time about a Starmie. Yeah, an awesome reward there. Anyways, the episode then ends the next morning, after everyone stayed at Birch's lab for the night, with Ash and the gang boarding a ferry at the Little Root Town port, so that they could leave Little Root Town and begin their journey to Fortree City. Because, they didn't want to have to walk all the way to Fortree from Little Root. They wanted to at least get closer to Fortree first. But as they go, they wave goodbye to Professor Oak, Joshua, and Professor Birch, because, Joshua had reunited with them after they went back to the lab, and Professor Oak and Professor Birch decided to stay with each other for a little while, so that they could sort out what they were going to talk about finally.